Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that my running mate Angela Walker and I ran on in 2020. So it's 2024, and we're just trying to get on the ballot in New York. And as I reported here the last 5-6 weeks, Saturday morning is a good opportunity for me to petition at a regional market. And again, like last week, I got 180 signatures since early this morning. So now, this evening, really soon after this podcast, all the volunteers from the Syracuse area are bringing in their last petitions. So we're going to clean them, make sure everybody does the witness statements right. And then I'll be handing them off to a Texas Green, Marlon Duran, forgive my Spanish. He's helping us tomorrow morning by taking petitions I received from Buffalo, Rochester, as well as Syracuse to New York City, where the petitions are being bound together with a schedule showing that we have at least 500 signatures in at least half of the congressional districts of New York. So there are 26 districts. We need to prove that in at least 13 districts. It's a massive job because you got to put a schedule attached to the petition showing where all these over 500 signatures in these 13 congressional districts are, which is like a schedule of at least 6,500 signatures. It's a massive job. The good news is, from reports I'm hearing, we have a good chance of going over 45,000 signatures, which we were required to collect in 42 days. It's the hardest petition in the United States. And from what I've been able to find out, I can't find one as hard anywhere in the world. The comparable petition for, a state or an oblast in Russia is 15,045 days. So our petition is about 3 times harder. But, we're doing what we can. Wish us all luck that we survive any challenges the Democrats are likely to submit against our petition. And in New York, aside from this petition, we're continuing to pursue legal and legislative remedies against this exclusionary new ballot access law that New York passed in 2020 that wiped out all the independent parties. We are right to be concerned about the assault on voting rights by the Republicans, but we also have to recognize that the Democrats are assaulting voting rights too. Party suppression is a form of voter suppression. You should have the right not just to vote, but to vote for who you want. And if you suppress parties, that's what Putin does. Suppresses his opponents that he think might really challenge him. He's not the only authoritarian government that has so-called elections that does that. What's sad is too many Americans don't recognize that this is going on in our own country. So we have a lot of work. The fight for democratic rights is essential. And that's why we need the Green Party, because that's what we're about, and the Democrats as well as the Republicans are not. And of course, top of the headlines again this week was Gaza. And early in the week, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Bibi Netanyahu, Defense Minister Gallant, and 3 Hamas leaders for committing war crimes. And then yesterday, the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court deals with individuals. International Court of Justice, or the World Court, deals with the crimes of nations. And it ordered Israel to immediately stop its assault on Rafah. And it also ordered Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release the Israeli hostages it holds. ICC, or International Criminal Court orders, or International Court of Justice orders, are International Criminal Court orders are international law in the 124 countries that have signed the Rome Statute that established the International Criminal Court. Israel and the United States are not signatories, but those arrest warrants will have impact because the Israeli and Hamas leaders that are subject to those warrants cannot travel to those countries, those 124 countries that have signed the Rome Statute onto the International Criminal Court. We've seen that in action recently. Putin couldn't go to South Africa for the BRICS conference last, I think it was August, because South Africa's a signer, and South Africa told him, "You come, we're going to have to arrest you." So he had to zoom in instead of be there. So it will have some impact. The World Court or International Court of Justice orders are international law, and the UN Security Council would have to enforce them. And of course, the U.S. is expected to veto any resolution that tries to enforce this order on Israel to stop the assault and for Hamas to release the hostages. And Israel, in this order, is required to report back to the International Court of Justice within a month. What Israel's done instead, responding immediately to that order, was to accelerate its bombing of Rafah, including civilian areas where many of the refugees are in tents. And it may be trying to complete its military operation in Rafah before the end of the month so it can tell the World Court it stopped its military operations in Rafah, which is not what the court asked. It said immediately stop. Hamas, for its part, welcomed the World Court order, but it did not say it would release the hostages. It did say it would cooperate with the World Court's plan to send an investigation committee into Gaza, but of course that will also require the cooperation of Israel, and Israel is not going to give it. So, it's important that this was done, but to enforce this international law under the way the international system is organized with the veto at the Security Council level means it's more a statement than something that can be enforced. Now, the Biden administration is obviously hypocritical because they supported the International Criminal Court when it issued arrest warrants for Vladimir Putin, his child commissioner, and those warrants are for abducting children from Ukraine for so-called re-education in Russia, without the permission of parents where they existed. They also grabbed orphans. So it supports those arrest warrants, but not the arrest warrants for Netanyahu and the defense minister of Israel. So for all Biden administration's rhetoric supporting what they have lately taken to calling the rules-based international order, I'm not sure why they do it. I think it's a ruse around international law because that's what the rules are about, and that those are founded on the UN Charter and the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And for all its lip service to these things, the Biden administration is undermining international law because of its hypocrisy. Biden, and I've mentioned this last week, I'm going to say it again, he ran on restoring U.S. standing in the world and its relations with other countries after the chaos and irresponsibilities of the Trump administration. And he kind of did that for a while. After hesitating to really defend Ukraine, you got, the NATO and EU countries and a large coalition to support Ukraine against Russian invasion. NATO, we could talk about whether NATO should exist and what should replace it, but whatever you think of it, you got to give Biden credit for making it more unified and stronger. I mean, Finland and Sweden decided to join because they began to fear Russian aggression. But all that he has done and could claim credit for, he's flushing down the damn toilet because he's tied to the hip with Netanyahu in this genocidal assault on Gaza. It's as much his war as Netanyahu's because despite his, public, hesitation and telling them don't go into Rafah, they go into Rafah, and then he still sells $1 billion worth of arms last week. This is political stupidity and moral depravity at the same scale or level as Johnson's massive escalation in Vietnam after he got reelected in 64 and really going in 65, and George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. Stupid and morally depraved. Now, I'm going to put a few things we are going to put a few things in the chat. Links to articles. I recommend an analysis of what happened to the Israeli peace movement over the last several decades that was written by Eric Alterman for the New Republic, or maybe it was American Prospect. And Eric Alterman is not my favorite person. I mean, if you saw one of those films about the Nader campaign in 2000, he's so whiny, about how Nader was spoiling the election and not really knowing what he was talking about. So, not my favorite author, but this is a good article. He interviewed a lot of the veteran Israeli peace activists, and gets their take on what happened to them as the politics of the far right in Israel became so dominant. And they also talk about how and why they persist despite their political weakness at this point. So I think it's an article worth reading, and I'm gonna get to the way he closes, but it reminded me of how the whole Israeli-Palestinian conflict is such a tragedy. You may have heard of Edward Said, who was a well-known Palestinian writer and activist who taught at Columbia University. And he wrote an article in the New York Times, we'll post this in the chat too, where he famously said, and this was in 1999, in the op-ed, he calls for a one-state solution, by which he meant a democratic secular state for both Israeli Jews and Palestinians. He said that the Palestinians are the victims of the victims of the victims of the Holocaust. And, that's what makes it such a tragedy. So Ultimate closes his article with quoting an Israeli stand-up comic and peace activist, Noam Schuster Eliassi. And you've heard of this slogan, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. He says the slogan we really need is, from the river to the sea, we all need therapy. Everybody's victims, and they're mistreating each other instead of finding some kind of common ground. Which brings up another article that I also want to put in the chat by Norman Finkelstein, who's another author that I'm not that big a fan of, particularly recently when he's been so opposed to what he calls identity politics, which is the politics of people fighting racial and gender oppression. And he's been hypocritical in his anti-imperialism by being selective. And he supported Russia's invasion of Ukraine, saying they have a right to Ukraine. That's like saying, the Americans had a right to the Indians' land instead of finding a way to live together. So at the same time, he opposes Israel's invasion of Palestinian territory. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there. But in this article, which is a write-up of a talk he gave to the Columbia University pro-Palestinian encampment, it's a good discussion of the importance of picking the right slogans to broaden your appeal and not undermine it. And I think the article is worth reading because of the way he brings that into focus. And for example, he says the slogan "Ceasefire Now" is great. It's clear. It's popular. But then he criticizes one of the chants, which I just mentioned, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." And he suggests, why don't we amend that? "From the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free." And that simple little amendment, he says, drastically reduces the possibility of your being manipulatively misunderstood. Because, of course, Republicans in Congress, university presidents, they're all saying "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" is anti-Semitic, which is, it originates with the PFLP, the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, when they were calling for a single state, secular and democratic, back in the 1960s. It was not against Jews. It was for the Palestinians to be free and equal. So Finkelstein's whole discussion about why it's important to formulate demands and slogans and chants in a way that builds support rather than isolates you. And there's a tendency in protest movements that feel embattled and embittered to settle for performative politics instead of popular politics. And that's a tendency we've got to resist, because as far as I'm concerned, we're not out here to just speak truth to power. We're out here to get some power so we can act on the truth. We're not just, like Quakers witnessing stuff. We want to change things. So it's not just about feeling good. It's about doing good by changing the system that is generating bad outcomes. So I think the Finkelstein article is thought-provoking and I recommend it as well. And then got to say some more about Ukraine. Russia's ground offensive continue. And despite the narrative you get from the Kremlin that Ukraine has lost, Russia has won, and it's just about to end, uh, Russia's been losing a lot to gain a little bit of ground. A lot of troops, a lot of military equipment, and now that particularly artillery munitions, are starting to reach Ukraine, so they're not outgunned 5-1 or 10-1 in being able to fire artillery. The Russian offensive in Kharkiv in the north is stalled, as well as outside Chasiv Yar in the east, which is their big objective, and along several other areas of operation where the Russians are trying to gain ground. But up there in Kharkiv, it's pretty tough. For the last 2 weeks, Russia's been attacking the Kharkiv Oblast. And the Russian military was expelled from most of the Kharkiv Oblast in September 2022. And this has been going on for a while. The Russian-backed separatists first tried to take Kharkiv after the Maidan Revolution in 2014. Russian secret services working with local mafia gangs who were the muscle for local oligarchs seized government buildings in Kharkiv as well as Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk in March 2014. And the people of Kharkiv defeated them decisively in Kharkiv. And, the Russians didn't get back in there until the full-scale invasion in 2022, and they were expelled by September of 2022. Russia thought that these people are Russian-speaking, so they're going to welcome us. But, the people there want to be Ukrainian. They want to be part of the Ukrainian government, not under the Russian government. And what's been going on is Russia's now really bombing Kharkiv. They've been doing it really for 2 years, but they've really escalated the frequency of strikes. They're bombing city apartment blocks and energy infrastructure, and they're just trying to render the city uninhabitable through barbaric campaigns to flatten the city, like Russia's done in the past in Grozny and Aleppo and Mariupol and Bakhmut and Avdiivka. And now Vovchansk, which is the northernmost village or small town in Kharkiv, where Russia is trying to get it, and they can't get it, so they're just flattening it. And that's what they call liberating Russian-speaking population of Kharkiv. They're liberating them from their homes, their jobs, and often their lives. Russia's the aggressor here. But that brings up a question I addressed last week, and I wasn't satisfied with where I left it. And that was the question of whether Ukraine should be able to use U.S. weapons that are provided to it against military targets over the border in Russia. And as I thought out loud about that question, I said I noted that the Biden administration has not given that permission because they're afraid Russia will respond with tactical nukes, which Russia's been bluffing for a long time. And I explained that I thought that was just a bluff. It's highly unlikely because Putin is not suicidal. He doesn't want the response that NATO would give him if tactical nukes were used. And that response would be massive. And we know from reporting at the time this really first started coming up in the fall of 2022, that it would probably not be nuclear in response to Putin using a tactical nuke, but it would be massive. It would be conventional, and it would cripple Russia's military and economy. And so I don't think Putin wants to provoke that. But I left my thinking out loud that I was doing that, saying that I was not sure about my position of letting Ukraine use U.S. weapons to strike Russian military assets in Ukraine. And, as I thought about it really just after the podcast, I said, no, that's not where I'm at. It is not escalatory for Ukraine to defend itself. And to defend itself, it needs to hit Russian military targets inside Russia. I mean, certainly at the least, it should be allowed to use the Patriot air defense systems to strike Russian aircraft that are firing these massive 1 to 3 ton glide bombs from Russian airspace into Ukrainian cities and military targets. Those are blockbuster bombs. They're the size of the bombs that Biden paused for a minute to send to Israel because they're so devastating to civilians and civilian infrastructure. But I think the Ukrainians should also be able to fire artillery and missiles at military targets, particularly just across the Russian border, when they're amassing to attack Ukraine in new fronts like Kharkiv, and they're amassing now outside Sumy, another oblast they tried to invade in 2022 and were pushed out of pretty soon thereafter. When they got defeated in Kiev Oblast, Sumy was the next one over, and when Russia retreated, they pulled out of there too, because the Ukrainians, unlike what Russia thought, was not welcoming them. But even right up near the border in Kharkiv, the Ukrainians could not dig good fortified trenches near the Russian border because Russian artillery was bombing them from just across the border with no retaliation from the Ukrainian artillery, at least with U.S. arms. But I think Ukraine should also be able to use the longer range ATACMS missiles, which it has now received from the U.S., to hit military targets like arms depots and arms factories, military bases, air bases, and military convoys on their way to the front lines in Ukraine. Those are defensive acts given that Russia is invading Ukraine. They're legitimate military targets. So I think the current policy of prohibiting the use of those weapons from the United States against Russian forces until they cross the border, while Russia bombs Ukraine without retaliation from within its own territory, it's costing the Ukrainians too many lives of civilians and soldiers alike. So, I just wanted to say a little bit more about that because I wasn't satisfied with where I left it. And finally, I'll just say, I keep getting disgusted over and over again at the selective anti-imperialism we have to stomach today. We have Biden, who opposes Russian settler colonialism in Ukraine to some extent. We could quibble that a lot of people are critical of him for providing enough so Ukraine doesn't lose, but not enough so it can win. But he opposes Russian settler colonialism in Ukraine while supporting Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine. It's stomach turning. And then we have people who claim to be on the left and they oppose Israeli settler colonialism in Palestine, but support Russian settler colonialism in Ukraine. I guess the far-right MAGA Republicans are the worst of anybody because they support both Russian and Israeli imperialism. But all these hypocrites, Biden Democrats, the Republican far-right, and the self-styled leftist campus, who decide they're going to be on the camp opposed to the U.S. no matter how bad those countries are, those positions are reactionary to the core. And what we need to be is consistent anti-imperialists who oppose all imperialisms. And all I can say is my stomach is turning from all this hypocrisy. But I'll leave it there and let's see your questions and comments. Scout Trooper 164. How do you feel now that Russia has suffered at least 500,000 casualties since the invasion began? Also, besides the lack of maintenance, how will the destroyed oil refineries impact the country? Well, that 500,000 figure is probably in the ballpark, but it's really hard to know. But it's tens of thousands and it's too many. It's terrible that Putin has just thrown these people as cannon fodder at the Ukrainians and then forced the Ukrainians to suffer casualties resisting them. Although most credible reporting I've seen says that, the ratio is pretty high on the Russian side and low on the Ukrainian side because the Ukrainians have mostly been defensive. They also use tactics that are more protective of troops on, infantry on the front lines. So how I feel about it, I feel terrible. It's terrible that this is going on. It's disgusting. And then, it's a bad precedent for, if Russia gets away with this, then imperialist countries are going to say, well, if Russia could do it, we can do it. Just like Russia's saying, well, if Bush could go into Iraq, why can't we go into Ukraine? It's undermining this so-called rules-based international order or international law. And U.S. is guilty of it, Russia's guilty of it, and it's making it harder. It's breaking down the norms that prohibited this kind of aggression since World War II and deterred a lot of it. I mean, we've had wars, but These are just blatant. And then, the figure I've heard uh, at this point is 13% of Russia's oil refining capacity has been destroyed by Ukrainian-made drones that have hit these things all over the country, from the Black Sea in the south to the Baltic Sea in the north, and going way far to the west, Tatarstan and places like that. Um, and we know it's hurt Russia's capacity to produce enough gasoline and diesel, because they are now in the middle of a 6-month moratorium that started March 1st on exporting those fuels, because they need them for their military and their domestic needs. And Ukraine keeps hitting those refineries. So how is it going to impact on Russia? Well, it reduces their sale of oil abroad, or refined oil products abroad, which hurts their revenues, which funds their military machine. And it's hurting their capacity to run their economy and their military, because they're running short on gasoline and diesel. So those are, effective military targets for the Ukrainians, and it's hurting the Russians. How deep that hurt gets, it's hard to say. 13%, they still got a lot of capacity, but it's enough to convince them they had to stop exports for at least 6 months. Vicky Corden, I'm afraid if Putin takes Ukraine, he will go after Poland, Moldova, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, etc. I'm more skeptical of that, because, if he goes after Poland, which is NATO, or Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, they're NATO, he's inviting NATO to come kick his ass. And, he's, I don't think he's that crazy. Now, Moldova, which is, I don't think, in NATO yet, and Russia's been occupying Transnistria, a part of Moldova, since the 90s. They have troops there. Some of their operatives came out of there during the anti-Maidan protests after the Maidan Revolution in 2014. I think where we got to watch is Georgia, where there's a mass movement against this so-called Russian law. It's a foreign agents registration law for people and nonprofits that get funding abroad, which in a poor country like Georgia, many of their nonprofits do, particularly those that are progressive, defending LGBTQ rights, other human rights, the environment. They have big environmental groups. It's a big environmental movement in Georgia. It hasn't translated into an effective Green Party since the 90s. And there's a young cohort of Greens that are trying to develop a more progressive Green Party. The old Green Party was good on the environment, kind of mainstream on economics, and conform to the social conservatism of Georgia. So there's a lot of turmoil on the progressive side there, but the people are united. They don't want this law because they don't want the kind of repression of the media and journalists and people in universities and the civil society that is going on in Russia from this kind of law. So there have been massive demonstrations. I think the weekend before last, they had 10% of the country, 300,000 people out in a country of 3 million, marching in the Capitol against this law. What happened was the legislature, which is in control of the ruling party, has a majority. They passed it. The president vetoed it, but then the legislature overrode that presidential veto. And the prime minister, who's the top dog, he's a billionaire who made his money in Russia, although he is ethnically Ukrainian. And he's an oligarch, so he has a lot of money for his party called Georgia Dream. What I'm saying is Russia already occupies 20% of Georgia out of a 2008 war. And in one of those, it's South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In Abkhazia, which is on the coast of the Black Sea, Russia's building a big military naval base. I think Georgia is in more threat. I think, Ukraine, Putin, he would like to rebuild the Russian Empire, not on the Soviet model, which gave some autonomy to different regions like Ukraine, but more on the old Tsarist model. He's definitely an imperialist, but He's also a realist. So I don't think, Poland and the Baltic states are likely to be the next targets. I think it's countries like Moldova, Georgia, uh, the various Muslim, countries that declared independence, like Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Tajikistan and all those countries in the south of the former Soviet Union and Russian Empire. So I think Putin is expansionist, but I don't think he'll go after, NATO countries next. That would just not make sense. But who knows? It didn't make sense for him to go into Ukraine. He nobody thought I didn't think he would do it. I thought it was just nuts, but then he did it. And it didn't go according to plan. The plan was to take Kyiv in a few days, kill Zelensky and his family and other top leadership, put in a puppet, and make Ukraine a puppet state like Belarus is of Russia. And it didn't work out the way Putin had planned. So that might have put a little pause in any, radical plans to go after NATO countries. There are weaker countries in the south and southeast of the former Russian Empire that, would be next targets. And, if he takes Ukraine, I think he will look to that. If he is stopped in Ukraine, then he's going to really have a hard time going into these other countries. And the best thing going on for Georgia in terms of their fear of intervention by Russia is that Russia's preoccupied with Ukraine. Although the Georgian military is very small, and a lot of their experienced members have gone to Ukraine to fight the Russians. So Georgia doesn't have much to defend itself if Russia decides to, step in, because the popular movement is in a position where they might overthrow or force the government that's now in power in Georgia to step down. So anyway, we need to stop Putin in Ukraine, and then there'll be less likely he'll go after other countries. At war with dust. What do you say to those like Aaron Mate, who, although otherwise sympathetic to leftist causes, consider Ukraine a proxy war to benefit defense contractors and the U.S. military-industrial complex? I think Aaron Mate, he's one of the people that turns my stomach, because he's always apologizing for these reactionary right-wing governments like Assad's Syria or Putin's Russia. And he's a campist. He's supporting anybody who's in opposition to the U.S. or in conflict with the U.S., no matter how reactionary they are. We can't choose one camp against another. I mean, the so-called multipolar world that they are promoting and extolling is really an inter-imperialist conflict between one bloc led by China, with Russia on its side, and countries like Iran in one loose bloc, and then the West, NATO, and the U.S. On the other. And we should not be on either side. We should be on the side of the workers, the oppressed, the exploited, international socialism, and support people who rise up against these reactionary regimes. And Aaron Mate doesn't do that. He supports counter-revolutionaries as long as they are opposed to the U.S. And those politics at core are reactionary. So what do I say to Aaron Mate? He should go to Ukraine and talk to the trade unionists and the feminists and the environmentalists and the socialists and see why they support the armed resistance to Russia's invasion, and why they are not a bunch of neo-Nazis like people like him claim, which is, absurd when you think about it. The country is led by a Jewish president, Zelensky. The defense minister is a Crimean Tatar Muslim. The governor who's appointed of Odessa is a Korean Ukrainian. In their parliament, they have a Rwandan Ukrainian who happens to be an Olympic medalist. That's why he got into parliament. But, Ukraine is ethnically diverse. There is a nationalist right that, is all about Ukraine and nobody else. But they're tiny. They're smaller than any right in anywhere else in Europe. When they ran in 2019, their presidential candidate got 1.56% in the first round, which eliminated him for the second round, where Zelensky beat the more nationalist Poroshenko, 75% to 25%. And then in their parliamentary slate, the coalition of right-wing parties got 2.15% for their slate, which meant they were well below the 5% threshold to get proportional representation. Look at our country. The Trump hardcore, the racist hardcore is at least 30%. ADF, the Alternative for Germany, is AFD, is threatening to take power, particularly in former East Germany. You got Le Pen in France. You got Mercolini, maybe whoever's head of Italy right now comes out of a party that descended from Mussolini. The guy in the Netherlands, also a right-winger. And these right-wingers have built their base on scapegoating immigrants, and now they're scapegoating environmentalists who they say are raising the cost of living with their climate action. So the far right is a problem, but Ukraine it's not where the problem is. It's in, throughout Western Europe and the United States. And the far right in those countries, they're the ones that align with Mate's friends like Putin and Assad in Syria. So I would say Mate needs to, talk to grassroots movements in these countries that are fighting oppression. And hopefully he's enough of a conscience left that he will see what they're about, and they are the left he should support. Scout Trooper 164, Orban is thinking of opting out of NATO. Any thoughts? I just think he's asking for trouble. Yeah, I don't know how realistic that is. I mean, I know he has consolidated power by changing the electoral system so it's less proportional and more like what we have, winner take all. So there are more district winner take all elections than proportional than there was before, which gives the plurality the power. So the support for his party in the public is magnified many times by winner take all when it gets to the parliamentary level. He's also undermined the judiciary like the Republicans have here. So he's got them on their side. And when it comes to NATO, I don't know. I mean, I can't tell. I'm not that up on internal Hungarian politics to see if there's even a popular support for getting out of NATO. Orban says a lot of stuff, but doesn't follow through, like in the EU, where he was obstructing Ukraine's accession or getting in line to become part of the EU. But what he was really doing was holding out for EU money for his country. And they finally cut a deal. And the same thing with getting Finland and Sweden into NATO. He held out for a while until he got some things from it. So part of what he's doing is bargaining with the other European powers for benefits for him. So that's about as far as I know. I just haven't heard, but maybe I'm just ignorant, that there's a popular movement in Hungary to get out of NATO. That I have never seen reporting on. It may exist, but I just haven't seen it. Andrew Hager, what about Edward Snowden? How can we formulate a plan to convince U.S. government officials and possibly the UN to pardon him for his actions? Well, the U.S. could pardon him, and when I ran in 2020, I said I would pardon him. He doesn't need a pardon because he hasn't been convicted of anything. The charges against him need to be dropped. And I said I'd bring him into the administration because I think he has a good handle on how to collect intelligence without violating people's privacy rights. And I've been not happy with some of his political positions over the last, 18 months. He seems to be a fan of some of these ex-leftists like, Glenn Greenwald and Matt Taibbi. He's more of a libertarian than a progressive green. But I think he's very good on the question of how to collect intelligence without violating people's privacy rights. And the book he wrote which the name of which is escaping me at the moment, but it was the most impactful book I read in 2019. And I urge people to take a look at it. It's an account of, how he decided to spill the beans that the NSA was spying on all of us, and how he decided to get the information out, and how he ended up in Russia, which is not where he wanted to go. But because the U.S. intervened in his ability to travel once he got out of Hong Kong, where he first landed and met with journalists like Glenn Greenwald, he was on his way. The Russian stop was on the way, I think, to Ecuador, but he couldn't get, I forget exactly what it was, but he couldn't get permission to fly through airspace in Europe or something, and he got stuck in Russia. Anyway, I think Snowden, he did a service to the country by exposing what the NSA was doing. And so I think the charges should be dropped, and he should be allowed to go free. Permanent Record. That's the book from Edward Snowden. And it's a book I highly recommend. It gives you a good insight as to what the intelligence community, what it's like, what it does. And it's a dramatic story of, how he decided to, do this. I mean, he was on a flight path, to, very comfortable and secure and highly paid position in the intelligence community or its contractors. And instead, he decided to do the right thing, which cost him. So I really recommend that book. Vicky Corden, any thoughts about using gas propane as a refrigerant instead of Freon beginning in 2025? You caught me on this one. I don't know the technology there. I guess Freon, the danger there is it leaks and it destroys the ozone layer. Gas propane as a refrigerant, I don't know about that. If that's a substitute, if that's what the environmental community has decided, I mean, that's good. And you say beginning on 2025, so I guess that this is a regulation or law that is passed. So, but I'm just not familiar with that, the technology there as to why gas propane works. That kind of surprises me. Propane. But, if it works and it, you don't want propane spilling into the water and things like that. But I guess if it works, it works. It's worth doing. Scout Trooper 164, any thoughts on the upcoming George Floyd documentary? Or perhaps his family asking for police reform? I'm not familiar with the documentary or what his family's been doing recently, although we are on the anniversary now of when he was murdered. And, I have been thinking about what happened to that movement. It was massive. It was organic, spontaneous. People were just outraged because we saw, on video what happened to him. He was strangled to death by that cop who has been convicted, which is good. But so there was a movement, but what was it demanding? It was demanding an end to police brutality. Question is, how do you do that? And back then, I was saying we need to fight for community control of the police so that they answer to us and they serve and protect us, not the power structure that uses them to enforce race and class segregation, because that's what the real estate industry has profited from, that racism and that class exploitation, for decades. Like white flight. The real estate industry, the white people leave and they have to sell cheap because the black people are coming. And then when the black people get there, they get sold over the price. They profit for real estate. And then when the white people move to the suburbs, the homes are overpriced. They go into debt, big mortgages. Real estate industry, which is not just the agents, but it's the people that own these buildings and sell them, It's the banks that finance all this. It's the lawyers that get paid handsomely for greasing the wheels. That whole industry has lived off that kind of racism. And the role of the police is to enforce the boundaries of class and race between neighborhoods. That's in the end who they answer to, instead of to us. So I was disappointed that where most of that movement went in 2020 was into electing Biden. Trump, they felt threatened by Trump, who's a, obvious racist. Dog whistles some, but sometimes he doesn't even use a dog whistle. And that's understandable. But what happened was the police are locally constituted and administered, so the federal government doesn't play that big a role. The movements didn't have a common program they came around. They came around community control in Chicago and they won it, although implementing it is now the struggle. In Minneapolis, I think they decided they go for community control. They just submitted a petition for an initiative, and they found some technical problems with it, so they're not going to get it this year. Those are, I think, better examples than what happened in most cities where, I'll just speak to Syracuse. The movement, ended up lobbying city council and the mayor. And as time went on, the pressure went down. And then in the end, nothing happened. And in fact, we have a citizens review board. And this goes back to the 90s, where we insisted on it being a citizens rather than a civilian review board, because we're not civilians against the military. We're all citizens, including the cops. So the Citizens Review Board. But it has not been performing since George Floyd got murdered. In fact, they're now looking at trying to reform it. It has a backlog of cases. The people appointed by the city council to the board are not showing up to meetings. So what happened to all that energy around stopping police brutality, reforming policing after George Floyd? I would say it got co-opted by the Democratic Party in the myth that the Democrats are really on our side on this issue. And it petered out. And we've seen this over and over again, going back to, the 60s when I was coming up and the Black Panther Party got formed in the Bay Area where I lived. A lot of the initial so-called riots of the 60s in the urban areas, the first one in Harlem in 64, it was a case of police brutality. Watts in 65, same thing. That always seems to spark it. And not just, in the United States. The Maidan Revolution, it was college students saying they wanted that EU agreement, not the agreement that Yanukovych signed with Putin. And they were, a few hundred students. And then they were getting ready to leave. And then Yanukovych sent his riot police to come out, go out there and crack heads. And they did. And then the people got really upset. And then it was thousands and thousands, tens of thousands in the streets of Kyiv protesting, not just, whether Ukraine was going to orient to the EU or to Russia, but against police brutality, the violence of Yanukovych's regime, and the corruption and the criminality of him and the other oligarchs he worked with. That's what, it became about. So police often provoke. We're seeing that right now with the encampments. The repressive reaction of university administrations has spawned, a spirit has provoked more response from the movement. And now it's not just about Palestine, it's about the treatment of students on institutions of higher learning that are supposed to be about academic freedom and open debate. And the administrations are shutting that down, which is spreading the movement. So this happens over and over again. So I think we'll have another round. There'll be some awful, and they're all the time. I mean, if you read the papers, the police are killing people, about 1,000 a year, often senselessly. And it just continues. But there'll be some particularly egregious thing that's going to catch people's eyes, and we'll be out in the streets again. But what we got to have is the movement needs a program in mind of the kind of reforms we want. And I think the problem with the review boards, they don't have the power to hire and fire the cops. That's what a community control would have. and that's really what we need. So the fourth year anniversary, I was thinking about that this week. It's what happened to that movement? I think it got pacified by people depending on the Democratic Party. And I can understand, where you don't have a green on the ballot, you might want to vote for the Democrat, but that's the least you can do. You got to have an independent movement with its own demands. So if that Democrat does get elected, they got to deal with you. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about where we are after George Floyd. Darren Ray Fonsu. Why does the Green Party stop pushing on workers' issues? It's no longer part of the major talking points we see from Green leaders and parties. I hear you, Darren. I think, Gaza, in the presidential race has become, something that's unavoidable. And, it's where Jill Stein, who's the probable Green nominee for president, stands out against Biden and Trump, as well as Kennedy, who's, shown up in the polls a little more. So that's understandable. Now, her slogan says she's got a pro-worker campaign, but we have yet to see policy papers or news releases or events that focus on workers' rights, economic justice issues. And I hope that's coming. I hope it's just been that Gaza's been on everybody's mind. And then as far as, the Green Party as a whole, Green leaders, parties, and candidates, I think it varies. It's uneven. For some, it's central to their campaigns. For others, it's not. And, that's just where we're at. But I think now is a good time to be talking about those issues, because we do have a bit of a revival of the labor movement. We have, these new initiatives at Amazon and Starbucks. And then we have the UAW reform leadership was elected and had a great bargaining session and strikes with the big three automakers. And they just won an important election in the South. They lost another one, but, organizing in the South, the Southern strategy for labor, has failed since World War II. That was one of the things the labor movement wanted to do after the big expansion of the labor movement during the 30s, and has never succeeded. Part of that was the Taft-Hartley Act that passed in 1946, maybe 47, when the conservative Congress came in the 46 election. And, the Democrats on paper have been for repealing the sections that allow right to work states and prohibit secondary boycotts, solidarity strikes, solidarity picketing, and those kinds of things, which is the way we build solidarity between different plants and offices and between different unions. Those things should be repealed. And that's one thing I wish the Green Party would talk more about. It's something Ralph Nader and then when he ran with Peter Kameo, they had some great news releases and position papers on that. So I think, those of us that are concerned about that issue need to, push the Greens to speak out on that, because the working class, is abandoned by the two major parties. They're totally corporate owned and dominated, and the agendas of both are basically neoliberal, privatization, deregulation, tax cuts for the rich, trickle down economics. And under Biden, that changed a little bit, but it's partly because the COVID crisis forced the government to spend public money. But a lot of those programs have been repealed. Now Medicaid is not is available, and we've, I forget the numbers, but it's millions of people have lost their Medicaid access. The child tax credit was the strongest child poverty suppressant in our history, and that got repealed. And there are Democrats pushing for it in Congress, but they don't have the votes. And the Greens should be out here, that should be one of our leading issues. So I think you raise a good question. And, Greens, we got to, push our party and our candidates to address these issues. And it's good politics, not just the right thing to do. Vicky Corden, any thoughts about the law that declares misoprostol, the abortion pill, a controlled substance in Louisiana? Yeah, those legislators in Louisiana, they're a lot of them are fundamentalist Christians. They're doing what their pastor says, and they got this bizarre interpretation of what the Bible says. It doesn't say anything like that. I'm not a Bible expert, but they didn't know what misoprostol was, and abortion is discussed in the Bible. It's not prohibited, at least consistently. I run into that when I was petitioning. These people are telling me they're voting for Trump. They don't like him, but he's against gays and he's against abortion. So that's all they care about because they're quote unquote Christians. But that's a particular narrow view of Christianity. And that narrow view is held by a lot of the legislators in Louisiana. And they don't represent most people. Most people want to be able to practice birth control and have abortion when it's appropriate for their circumstances. And I think the Republicans have put themselves out on a limb and they're cutting it off and they're going to crash. So we talked about last week the referendum in Florida. I mean, these things are going to be. This is a central issue for the fall campaign, and so I think it's terrible what Louisiana did, but it's not popular, and I think it's going to come back to bite those so-called Christians. How do you think the death of Iran's president will impact the country? Asked Scout Trooper 164. Well, I think the regime will try to consolidate their power. From what I've read, there's not going to be any reformers running in the next election, which is coming up to replace this president, who's a hardliner. This president was the guy in charge of the execution of thousands of leftists in Iran once Khomeini consolidated his power. This was in the early 80s. The revolution was in 79, and there was and when they consolidated their power, they just took and some of them were their allies in overthrowing the Shah, and just killed all the leftists they could find, thousands of them. And they're going to try to find somebody like this guy who did that to replace him. But also, there are popular movements in Iran. There are ethnic minorities, Kurds and Balochs and others, for whom the regime is not popular, and the regime knows it. So I don't know how stable the regime actually is, given the popular discontent. We've seen it. We've seen these uprisings repeatedly in this century. The last one was the Women Life Freedom uprising, initiated by police brutality. They killed this young woman for not wearing her hijab properly, and that's always underneath the surface in Iran. So I've also heard that when this guy was confirmed he died, people were having parties. They were dancing in the streets. He was not popular. So, there's a conflict between the power of the regime and the sentiment of many masses of Iranians. So, I'm not predicting what will happen, but I'm saying the situation is not as stable as people might think. Via email, do you think that Trump will be convicted in his hush money trial? I think he will. I hope he will. Michael Cohen has already been convicted, and Trump knew what he was doing the whole time. So it's hard to imagine that Trump will get out of this. But, slick lawyers and fickle juries, you can't be 100% sure of everything. But I think he's going to be convicted. And they're about to go into, or maybe they've already gone into deliberations, the jury, or certainly after this Memorial Day weekend. And I hope they come back quickly with a guilty verdict. So, but we'll see. Ask the R, stacked courts. Yeah, Supreme Court reform should be a big issue. The court can be expanded to just dilute this conservative majority. I like the reform of term limits. So if you have 18, I think 18 years gets you a justice retiring every year if you stagger it right. So every president, no, every 2 years. Yeah, they're 9 justices, so it'd be every 2 years. And that would allow every president to appoint 2 members of the Supreme Court, so that it couldn't, what the Republicans were able to do couldn't happen, which is, hold off Merrick Garland. Not that he would have been so great, for what was it, 9 months, because quote unquote an election was coming up, and then ramming through one of those right-wing justices, who was named in September, just, weeks before the early November election. So they got to appoint, the Republicans got to appoint more justices than they should have, given who was elected president. So I like that, term limits should be part of it. Another thing I remember Bernie Sanders suggesting is that this Congress could require this, is that you have federal appeals court justices rotate onto the Supreme Court and off. So you don't have the same fixed, majority and minority on the Supreme Court. And, he had a legal argument for that. Well, that's when he was running in 2020, which I thought was interesting. So, yeah, Supreme Court reform should have a higher profile in this election. And but Biden's too conservative to raise it. Trump likes the way things are right now. And I hope the Greens will raise it in their presidential campaign. The problem is it's hard to get any attention to the issues the Green candidates raised. I get the Google alerts for Jill Stein and Cornel West, and 95% of the things in the Google alerts, which is where they are mentioned, is about polling. Very, very few interviews or mention of them when issues are being analyzed. So that's a challenge for the Greens. And I don't think it'll change until we got ranked choice voting and proportional representation to the point where we get people in Congress, and then the Greens become part of the conversation, like they are in the UK, in even in Canada. And they have a winner-take-all system, but they have less of a political culture where people are wedded to 2 major parties. They really have 3 large parties. The Greens are the 4th party, and they've had up to 3 representatives in their parliament. And they have regional parties that have representation. So all I'm saying is, the Greens play a much minor role in our debates than our support in the public for our positions would merit. And the electoral system really constrains us in that regard, because it magnifies pluralities into overwhelming majorities. And almost every election district is a one-party district. So we have a one-party state with 2 kind of labels depending on what district you're in. And despite their, bitter and sarcastic and, impolite, or I don't know how to characterize it, comments about each other on the basic economic and foreign policy questions, they're on the same page. And it's not the page we're on. So that's why we need the Greens and why we need to change the electoral system. Okay, our hour is up for this week. I don't have a guest for next week. The week after, I will have one of those New Jersey congressional candidates on. Although I may have another candidate that I'm hoping we get on soon, even next week. So we'll be having more candidates that are running, in this case, for Congress. I still want to get Frank Habineza, the Green from Rwanda, running for president. Their election's in July. got to work out a time. We may do that one. We may have to tape that one and then just play it for you on Saturday because I haven't looked, but I have a feeling 3 p.m. here is like 3 a.m. there. Not a good time for him when he's running a campaign, but we'll see. In any case, we'll bring on more guests and keep talking about these issues, and we will be here next week, same time, 3 p.m. Eastern, Saturday, or you can catch it on podcast platforms during the week, or on Twitter and Facebook if you can't wait for the podcast. So anyway, thanks for being here, and we'll see you next week.